I'm sitting on the front doorstep of a house that Annamalai Swami built sometime after he left Ashram in 1938. Before we go inside and have a look, I just need to recap a few details of what happened to him in Ashram and how he ended up in this particular place. So Annamalai Swami first came to Bhagavan in early 1929. He had a spell of working as Bhagavan's attendant, and then Bhagavan selected him and said, "You will build all the ashram buildings under my supervision." So over the next 10 years, all of the big granite solid buildings in the ashram were constructed by Annamalai Swami, two plans that were personally drawn up by Bhagavan, and the work itself, though executed by Annamalai Swami, was done under Bhagavan's direct supervision. Bhagavan set him a very grueling schedule. Annamalai Swami said, "I don't think I sat down for 10 years. He said, if Bhagavan ever saw me sitting and meditating, he would just invent some new job for me to do. He just kept me continuously busy for 10 years. After all of the big buildings in the ashram, except for one, had been constructed, Annamalai Swami said, "I was in Bhagavan's bathroom with one other attendant, and the other attendant, out of curiosity, said, 'Bhagavan, these sadhus who smoke ganja,' that's cannabis, 'they seem to get very blissful. What is the relationship between the bliss that the sadhus experience from smoking ganja and the bliss that comes from spiritual practice?" So instead of giving a direct answer, Bhagavan imitated a stone sadhu. He goes, "Ananda, Ananda," Ananda being the word for bliss. So he put on a performance of being a completely stoned sadhu, staggering around his bathroom, going, "Ananda, Ananda," until he got in front of Annamalai Swami, at which point his outstretched arms reached round Annamalai Swami and he gave him a hug, and Annamalai Swami said, "Instantly I went into samadhi. I completely lost my body consciousness. There was no awareness of the world. I was completely rooted to the spot. I have no idea what happens next because I was completely unconscious. All I know is that at some point later that morning I became aware of my body, the world, the surroundings. Bhagavan had gone, the other attendant had gone." And he said there was something climactic about this particular experience. He knew that although he had spent 10 years working every day for Bhagavan, under Bhagavan's supervision, he knew that particular chapter of his life had come to an end. He realized that from that moment on he was going to sit and meditate in Pelakottu and try and put Bhagavan's teachings into practice. He knew, of course, that to do this he had to go and see Bhagavan, explain what he wanted to do and get his approval, but somehow inside he knew that this was the next phase of his life. So he found Bhagavan, explained what had happened, and he said, "I want to go and meditate in Palakottu, may I have your permission?" Bhagavan knew, I think, this was coming. I think he gave him the experience in order to push him off in that direction. Bhagavan was very happy with this. He said, "Yes, you go and meditate." So when Annamalai Swami got up that morning, he was a full-time, more than full-time. He had a job and a half working for Ashram, looking after all their building work. And just in the space of half an hour, all that finished. He took his keys to the ashram manager, Chinnaswami, said, I'm resigning, here are all my keys, I'm off to Palakottu. Everyone was completely astounded because he'd never discussed this. This was just something precipitated by this direct experience in the bathroom. Everyone, of course, said, "But how are you going to support yourself?" This was a man who had no money, no sponsors, no means of supporting himself. He just said, "I don't know, not my business. I'm going to Palakottu, that decision has been taken, Bhagavan has approved, I'm leaving." So he started walking to Palakottu. He didn't have a job, he didn't have any money, he didn't have anywhere to stay that night. And as he was walking, he bumped into Managala Venkatramaya. We've already discussed him outside. He was the person who compiled talks with Sri Ramana Maharishi. He had a hut here, so he told Managala, I've just decided to leave the ashram, I'm going to live in Palakottu. Managala said, oh, that's great, I've been called back to Bombay on urgent business, here's the key to my house, you can go and stay in my house till I come back. So that solved his immediate problems. Then one of his close friends in the ashram, Major Chadwick, heard that he'd moved to Palakottu, that he didn't have any means to support himself. So he arranged for someone to come every day, cook lunch for Annamalai Swami. So just a combination of circumstances. He got the experience from Bhagavan in the morning. An hour later he'd handed in his own keys, he'd collected his key to this hut in Palakottu, and by lunchtime one of his oldest friends in the ashram had arranged for him to be fed. So this situation continued for a while, and then Annamalai Swami was standing probably quite close to where I'm sitting right now with a devotee who he had used to build some of the ashram buildings, called Aramagam. So they weren't talking about building Annamalai Swami a house, they were just standing having a casual chat, more or less where I'm standing right now. Bhagavan came by on his morning walk to Palakottu, saw Annamalai Swami, who was the ashram builder, talking to Aramagam, who was one of the main masons. And I think possibly in a joking way he said to Aramagam, oh, are you going to build Annamalai Swami a house? Which of course he wasn't planning to do. And Aramagam said, it was as if I had no choice or decision over what I said. He said, yes, I'm going to build Annamalai Swami a house. And Annamalai Swami looked at him and thought, well, that's news to me. And then Bhagavan said, oh, make sure you build him a good one, build him a nice big house. So suddenly Aramagam felt compelled to carry out his obligation that Bhagavan had come. He'd made this promise in front of Bhagavan he was going to build a house, and he didn't have any money, Annamalai Swami didn't have any money. What they had was Bhagavan suggesting that a house be built, and Aramagam, for no reason whatsoever, blurting out, yes, I will build a house. So when things like this happen, when Bhagavan has pushed events in a particular way, they always have a habit of working out in a good way. And as it turned out, money came from unexpected sources, a building started, and one of my favourite, it's a long complicated story, but one of my favourite bits of the story was when Bhagavan came one day and the foundations had been dug for the building, and what they had was a gigantic hole full of boulders. And Bhagavan looked and got very excited and said, oh, you found buried treasure. And they all looked at this pile of boulders and thought, what's he talking about? And this was Bhagavan, as usual, being not wasteful of available resources. He said, well, what happens when you want to build a house? You dig a hole, then you have to get some big stones for the foundations, then you have to put them on a truck, get them delivered, put them in your hole. Look what's happened here, you've dug yourself a hole and the big foundation stones are already there. There's your buried treasure, this is the foundation you can build your house on. So every day Bhagavan would come, the house would get bigger and bigger. There were a few dramas over finances, how it was going to be finished, but as with all projects that Bhagavan supervised, everything came to a satisfactory conclusion. There's one point I want to make. When the walls were up, Annamalai Swami was deciding what kind of roof he was going to put on, and Bhagavan said, in my house we used palmyra timbers. Palmyra is the toddy tree, it looks like a coconut tree shape. He said that's very strong, it's very useful for making ceiling timbers. That's the kind of roof support we had in our house in Madurai, it worked well for us, you should do the same here. So it's indicative of the kind of hands-on approach that Bhagavan had, that he liked to use cheap, available local materials, but he also had an eye for quality. He wanted jobs to be well done, he wanted materials that were durable, that would last a long time. Now this house was built somewhere around 1938-39, the basic structure that Annamalai Swami and Aramagam put up together in 1938 it's still there, and we can go inside and have a little look at it. This is the room where Annamalai Swami used to meet devotees and talk to them. All the years I used to see him, he would sit on a sofa in the corner where that water bottle is. People would sit on the floor in front of him, and he would answer their questions. Now, one thing I like about Annamalai Swami, there are lots of things I like about him, is he didn't want to be a guru. He didn't want to sit on a sofa and have people stare at him, meditate in front of him. He used to tell people, if you have a question about Bhagavan, his life or his teachings, or any topic relating to practical advice on meditation, you come, you ask your question, and when you've got your answer, if you want to meditate, go back to Ashram and meditate there. So in a sense, he was never in the guru business. He didn't want people to come, but he did concede that he had a certain knowledge, a certain ability to talk to people, to answer their questions. He had a vast fund of information about Bhagavan's life. He understood Bhagavan's teachings very well, and he was an outstanding teacher, I have to say this. This is a man who was sent to school by his father when he was 5 years old, and his dad said, learn how to sign your name. He said, that's the only thing that school is useful for. When you've learned how to sign your name, come home and you can work in my fields. So Annamalai Swami's entire education lasted less than 2 weeks, during which he learned the alphabet and learned how to write his name, and then his dad pulled him out of school and set him to work in the family fields. So here was a man with almost no formal education. When he arrived at Ashram, he couldn't write, he couldn't do arithmetic, and yet Bhagavan not only made him construct major projects that needed engineering skills, he also made him keep the accounts. And this was a man who'd never even learned basic arithmetic. So he had a very steep learning curve. He had some help, but Bhagavan refused to subcontract those jobs to anybody else. He just told Annamalai Swami, get on with it, you learn these skills, you're the man I want to do this. So what I was really going to say was, here is a man who didn't talk from book knowledge. He didn't talk from information he'd got from anything else except what Bhagavan had told him and what he discovered himself through his own spiritual practice. So to come and see him was to get, in a way, is to get very raw, uncompromising teachings directly from the source. What I liked about him, he was very shy and withdrawn. I just want to demonstrate how Annamalai Swami was when you came to see him. He would sit on his sofa, and there was something physically closed about him. He'd be a little bit hunched up, and then he wouldn't be looking at you. And then you'd say, Swami, how do I do self-inquiry? And he'd start blah, 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 blah. He'd start muttering. And if he liked what you were saying, if he thought you were asking interesting questions, useful questions, and that you were listening to his answers, like his head would slowly come up. And it was like a flower opening. The more he realized that you appreciated what he had to say, the louder his voice would get, the more animated he would get. He would expand. His whole body would open up. His smile would come on his face, and by 10 or 15 minutes into the conversation, if you were on his wavelength, if you were talking about sadhana, Bhagavan, practice, the only thing that really appealed to him anyway, these were the topics he wanted to talk about, then he'd be full on. He'd be totally animated, totally talkative, and you had a great time with him. But somehow, if you weren't talking about things that interested him, he'd kind of stay in this little kind of hunched up mode. And this was interesting because there was an old devotee of Bhagavan called G.V. Subramaya, and he wrote an account of how Ramana Maharishi, to some extent, was the same. He said Bhagavan would sit on his sofa, and he said it was a skilled art getting an answer from Bhagavan. You had to be very brief, you had to be to the point, you didn't need to ramble, and most of all, don't interrupt when he started speaking. So he said people would come, and if they knew the technique, they would address a question to Bhagavan, And Bhagavan might look initially as if he hadn't noticed you, listened to you, had no intention of replying to you. But G.V. Subramaya said, don't be tempted to repeat your question or prompt him. He said, just sit there, be quiet. He's listened to you, he's heard you. There's some response is kind of bubbling up. And he said, then Bhagavan would start talking. He would be quiet, he'd be slow, possibly a little hesitant. And if he could see that you were interested and that no one was interrupting him, his speed would increase, he would get more and more animated. If he was telling stories about the gods or the saints, he'd start acting out the part of all the people in the stories. And he said the one thing you absolutely never could do was say, but Bhagavan, what about this? Or, this doesn't make sense. And then he'd go back into his shell again. So it was a question of giving one simple question that would trigger a response, waiting for the question to sink in, and then Bhagavan would suddenly bloom. He'd get into this incredibly animated mode. And what G.V. Subramaya said was that you have to understand that Bhagavan wasn't talking from a mind to a mind. When you asked these very short, terse questions, you were somehow triggering the self. You were triggering Brahman to give a response. And if you could sit quietly, you could sit patiently, then God himself, then Brahman himself would get more and more voluble, and you'd get this exceptional answer. And he said the trick was, don't interrupt, don't assume he hasn't heard, just sit there and wait for the whole unfolding process to happen. And I saw that to some extent with Annamalai Swami. He would start in this little like a little hunched up old man sitting on a bench, and if somehow he felt you were talking about the things that he cared about, slowly, everything would open up and you'd have a great conversation with him. So this room that we're in is his audience room. This is where you saw him, met him, talked to him. This is the door to the original house that he and Bhagavan built back in the 1930s. So let's just have a look at it as we go in. So we're now inside the building that Annamalai Swami and Aramagam built under Bhagavan's supervision in the late 1930s. I assume these are the original beams that Bhagavan told Annamalai Swami to make out of palmyra wood, because that's how his house was built in Madurai. This tile floor is classic South Indian floor. The ashram dining room was made of the same material about the same time. This, I'm not sure if this is an original fixture. I haven't been in here for a long time, but if you can do a close-up, this is Annamalai Swami here. He's the one with the white dhoti, the folded arms, and a big smear of vibhuti across his.
Okay. Well, you can point to
Here's Bhagavan, of course. This is Chinnaswami, Bhagavan's brother, who ran the ashram. Now, earlier this afternoon we talked about him. That's Managala Venkataramaya, the compiler of talks. This is Yogi Ramaya. We haven't spoken about him. He was Annamalai Swami's neighbour that way. He was a silent yogi, so not much to say about him because he didn't really talk or write anything. This man here, that's Maurice Friedman. We're going to talk about Maurice Friedman. He was a very important person, in my opinion, in ashram life. Down here we're going to mention him later. This is T.P. Ramachandra Iyer. He was the ashram's lawyer, and I'm going to tell a couple of stories about him later. These group photos would happen every few months in Ramanashram, and most of the people I talk about, they appear in them again and again and again.
First of all, how many years did you know him yourself? How many years did you associate with him?
7 or 8. Well, I knew of him, but I hadn't really talked to him until I started interviewing him.
So you associated with him for 7 years?
I came and talked to him every day, every afternoon for weeks and weeks and weeks, and I got his story, and then I went away, and then I came back and gave him my version, and we went through it together. And then after that I would just come occasionally.